So, so welcome back to everyone who's with us this morning, as well as to anyone who is just joining us now. At this point, we're going to move on to our second presentation with Dr. Emily Warner. Let me give a few words of introduction to Emily, and then I'll turn things over to you. Emily Warner is a historian of American and 20th century art. Her book manuscript, Abstraction Unframed, Abstract Murals at Mid-Century, studies the relationship between abstract murals and modern architecture in the mid-century United States, from the New Deal to the early Cold War. Her work has been published in the Archives of American Art Journal and by the Tate, and supported by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Daedalus Foundation, and the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. She has taught at Vassar College, the Courtauld Institute of Art, and Queen Mary University of London, and she will start as an assistant professor of visual arts at the University of Oklahoma this fall. So Emily, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you for bringing together this wonderful group of scholars for what's such a beautiful exhibition. I'm sorry I'm not able to see it in person, but it was such a great tour to have of it at the beginning. On a personal note, I also just want to say it's especially gratifying for me to be presenting in connection with the Eskenazi, because it's where I did some of the very first research for what turned into my dissertation and then my book project. I went to Bloomington fresh off my field exams at graduate school to look at Stuart Davis, to make the pilgrimage to see Swing Landscape. So it's really great to be back here now presenting some more recent work. Let me share my screen with you. In 1941, abstract painter Susie Frelingheisen executed a remarkable suite of frescoes for the dining room of her country estate in Lenox, Massachusetts. A professional singer who had only seriously turned to abstract painting around 1935, Frelingheisen made the murals as part of a broader exercise in modernist living, in which modern architecture, design, art collecting, and fresco painting together created a space of heightened aesthetic perception. Although the frescoes are a striking and fairly unique example of an immersive abstract environment in US art in this period, they've been relatively little studied. Some of this lack of attention derives from Frellingheisen's particular situation. Although a dedicated and prolific artist, she didn't publish or speak much about her work, which is in stark contrast to her husband, artist George L.K. Morris, who was a very vocal advocate for abstract art in America. Frelingheisen also belongs to a type of American abstraction, predominantly geometric, oriented towards Europe, that thrived in the interwar years, but would be thoroughly supplanted historiographically by the gestural painting of abstract expressionism in the post-war era. Although I should note, this is something that is changing in the historiography, thanks in no small part to many of the co-speakers on today's symposium. But the lack of attention to Frelingheisen and her Lenox murals is also symptomatic of a wider disregard for the work of women muralists in the modern period. The histories of modern muralism, and of abstract muralism especially, are peopled largely by men. In my talk today, I'll examine some of the reasons for this and hopefully offer some new avenues for research into modernist murals by women. I'll start by discussing some of the features of the mural field in the decades around World War II. This broad mid-century period from the mid-1930s to the late 1950s, early 1960s, is one that was deeply preoccupied with the question of public life and art's ability to intervene within it. I'll discuss here some of the obstacles to realizing a finished mural, the relationship of the New Deal programs to private mural commissions in the post-war years, and the ongoing tension between the mural as a bounded work of art and as a decorative component. And I'll consider how these features particularly affected the production and reception of murals by women. Next, in the second half of my talk, I'll focus in depth on the Lenox frescoes by Frelingheisen. Jean Charlot's fresco class in action, a now lost mural from 1941, depicts students enrolled in the artist's fresco painting class at the Art Students League of New York. Painted directly on the walls of the league's basement, where the French-Mexican artist taught his class, it shows the teacher and his students engaged in the various stages of fresco making, from sketching and measuring to scaling up, photographing, and preparing the plaster surface. The fresco offers an interesting window onto mural pedagogy at mid-century, and one that is surprisingly female, with women making up 5 of the 8 students pictured. And then you also have Charlot in the finished mural, although not in the sketch, in the lower right corner. I'll return to Charlot's class at the League later in the talk, but I'm showing it here because it presents us with an interesting question. At what point along the way do women, represented quite well here, drop out of the mural narrative? Is it a historical phenomenon, or is it a result of later scholarly omission or bias? One answer does point us back to the historical field, and in particular to the difficulties entailed in realizing a finished mural. Lee Krasner offers an instructive example here, as she was interested in muralism from around 1937 onward, and yet didn't complete a realized permanent mural for over 2 decades. We've already seen both of these works actually in Greta's lovely presentation this morning. A series of mural sketches from 1940, when Krasner was employed by the New Deal's Works Progress Administration, show the artist using abstraction to activate a specific architectural space with the forms variously biomorphic, geometric, and even somewhat gestural, flowing around architectural elements such as windows. We don't have full details on this mural project, so we don't know why it never moved beyond the sketches here. The following year, Krasner produced sketches for another WPA mural project, the Radio Studios. Sorry. There we go. The Radio Studios at station WNYC in the Municipal Building in New York. Another work which I believe is in the present exhibition. In this case, Krasner's mural never reached completion because of changes within the WPA itself. With the entry of the US into World War II, the existing WPA art programs were reorganized as the graphics section of the War Services Program, whose goal was to support the war effort. So in this case, the obstacle to completion occurred at the level of patronage. The commissioning institution, in this case, the federal and state governments, was no longer willing to sponsor the project. But in other cases, we see tensions or disagreements occurring with the architect, with other approval committees, or even with the viewers, the intended audience. And Jenny talked a little bit about this with respect to Davis's Swing Landscape in her introduction, that artists under the New Deal didn't really have full artistic control because of all these sort of stages of approval, et cetera. And in a way, that's true of muralism in general. It's very clear with the WPA programs because they're so highly bureaucratic and administrative. We can see the particular places in which the mural collaboration falls apart. But for murals in general, that collaboration is sort of always something to be negotiated and a potential place for the mural to not be ultimately realized. Such obstacles notwithstanding, women did complete and installed modernist murals in the 1930s and 40s. And I'll show a couple examples here, especially of work that I think deserves further study. Textile designer Ruth Reeves, also under the sponsorship of the WPA programs, designed a mural series for the cafeteria of the Andrew Jackson High School in Queens, which blankets walls and piers with abstracted depictions of school activities. There was a question earlier about murals in public schools, and this was one such example produced on the WPA. Here, art making, sports, and music are stylized into a rhythmic and often witty pattern of interlocking forms. Although well documented by the WPA, the work is no longer extant as far as I know. And this too is a big impediment to writing more complete mural histories because scholars, myself included, tend to focus on the murals that are there. Even when murals do make it from initial conception to installed work of art, they remain very vulnerable to the neglect or even outright hostility from viewers, both at the time that they're created and after. Rosalind Bengelsdorf Brown's wall paintings for the Central Nurses Home on Roosevelt Island in New York, which we've also already encountered today, is another modernist mural that's been lost to later neglect. A member of the American Abstract Artists Group, Bengelsdorf submitted several sketches for a wall painting that would decorate the fifth floor living room of a nurse's residence. Although approved by the WPA, initial designs, including this one, were rejected by the Art Commission of New York, now the Public Design Commission, which exercised artistic control over art in municipal New York buildings. As Greta noted, the final approved design, while still abstract, incorporated more overt references to musical instruments. Bengelsdorf later reflected on the degree to which the New Deal programs were a boon to abstract muralism, noting, quote, considering how few artists were producing them, the number of accepted abstract murals in proportion to the total output of the mural division was phenomenal. Of course, there were rejections, but from what I gathered, vetoes had little to do with whether the art was abstract or not, end quote. And Greta, you had asked about if this work was ever actually installed, and I too have seen those kind of conflicting reports that it wasn't installed and that it was. Bengelsdorf herself said that it was installed when Susan Larson interviewed her for the dissertation that she did in the 1970s, but I've never seen any photographs of it on site, which does sort of hinder the ability to kind of analyze it within that spatial setting. Now, these obstacles that I've been describing are not incidental, I want to stress. They're really fundamental to muralism. They derive from the way that murals bring artist, architect, patronage, and public into new and often very interesting relationships. And while they exist across the board, sort of for that whole mural field, my sense is they do have a disproportionate effect on women realizing their murals. And my sense is this comes from a bias against women within the architectural arts that is against women's ability to meet the conceptual and manual demands of an art that shapes space. This bias dates back to before the modernist murals that I'm talking about today. The Beaux-Arts muralist Violet Oakley, who in 1902 was awarded the largest mural commission ever given to a woman, encountered a lot of this kind of thinking, even when the attention that she received was sympathetic. One reporter, for example, wrote about her murals that, quote, such gigantic undertakings, gigantic both physically and intellectually, are a responsibility from which many men would shrink, end quote. The implication being, of course, that Oakley is particularly unique as a woman in being able to face such grand undertakings. And this idea continues in the mid-20th century years, and I think it does skew the decisions of all of those collaborators and intermediaries that I've been referring to, architects, reviewing committees, administrators, et cetera, against approving or even just fully supporting women's mural designs. If we think of Krasner's experience again, yes, she's invited to submit sketches for the WNYC radio studios, but she's the only woman who's asked to do so. And in fact, it's after murals by 4 men, including Davis, have already had their designs approved and installed. A second feature of the mid-century mural field that's important for women's production is how the New Deal projects enabled private murals in the post-war era. The bias against women as muralists is countered to some degree by the way that the New Deal as a whole pulled women into the arts and exposed them to new mediums like muralism. Although Krasner never saw her New Deal projects realized, that experience certainly catalyzed her interest in muralism, which resulted in 1959 in a mural for 2 Broadway, a speculative office building in Lower Manhattan. The commission for that mural came from Uris Brothers, the real estate company that developed 2 Broadway, and whose then vice president was B.H. Friedman, who had connections to many artists and would indeed leave the job at Uris Brothers to later turn to art writing full time. Dorothy Bruce Farr is another artist and an understudied one who is worth mentioning in this regard. With her husband, Fred Farr, she executed a mural for the New Deal's Treasury section of Fine Arts, which was installed in a recreation room of the Social Security building in Washington, D.C. And then after the war, she works both with her husband and also alone on projects, including mosaic murals, textiles, and abstract designs, including a very interesting one in conjunction with designer Bertha Schaefer for the showroom of the Singer Furniture Company, made out of different commercial sandpapers, and which you can see on the right of the slide. The relationship between these two moments on either side of World War II, that is between the New Deal and the New Deal programs themselves, and then the private art market of the 1950s and 60s, has been discussed extensively. And I think seeing them together is especially important for understanding women's contributions to muralism. Twin booms in the art market and in construction in the early post-war years meant that there was now money and wall space for mural commissions on a scale that really hadn't been seen in quite some time. Furthermore, because much of that building boom was concentrated in office space, much of that building boom was concentrated in office space, and the corporation became a very important patron of the arts, including of public murals and sculpture. But the interest in muralism, which this new patronage meets and responds to, was itself very much a product of the New Deal era, which had introduced not just women artists, but also a generation of viewers to the mural as a modern art form. And throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s, the language used to describe these private commissions is very much the rhetoric that's first kind of developed and articulated in the New Deal. In press releases and newspaper articles about murals for office lobbies, office facades, religious buildings, community centers, we read that art is taken out of its ivory tower, reinserted into the flows of daily life, and able to meet people where they live and work. The post-war works by artists like Krasner and Farr also point us to a third and final feature that I want to highlight, and that's the convergence of muralism with design, especially in the post-war years. Farr's abstract arrangement of sandpapers for the Singer Furniture Showroom can be seen as a mural, but also as the astute decorative treatment of a wall, giving texture and rhythm to the room. The mural, in a sense, disappears here into the broader architectural space. It becomes a decorative component, completely integrated into the architecture. And in so doing, it loses some of its autonomy as a work of art. A number of gallerists and critics in these years begin to understand murals under the rubric of decoration. It becomes sort of not a painting set aside in its own right, but what you can do with a wall, what kind of decorative or spatial treatments you can do, and the implications that will have for surface and the creation of space. Bertha Schaefer, whose article I'm showing you on the slide, is a really interesting example here. She's both an interior designer and a gallerist that shows modern art. And she's interested in a lot of these artists, many of them women, who are sort of right in between what we might call fine art and craft, or fine art and design. Architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable wrote about this phenomenon extensively in the 1950s, at times dismissing the work of painters who turned to muralism and celebrating instead the craftspeople and designers who were more adept at thinking spatially and architecturally. As she wrote in 1959 in the journal Craft Horizons, it is not, quote, always the work of the fine artist that is needed in a building. Not all painters or sculptors work in an idiom compatible to the needs of architecture. Almost all of the crafts, on the other hand, are potential instruments of legitimate architectural enrichment. And she goes on in the article to single out mosaic, concrete, aluminum, and others as expressive materials that are ideally suited to modern architecture. Now, this ideal of integration with architecture is not new in the 1950s. The abstractionists of the 1930s and 40s talk about their murals in a similar way as a kind of architectural painting. But with the proliferation of mosaic, textiles, and other crafts in the war and post-war years, and the increasing prominence of design as a field, there's a greater porousness around the concept of the mural, which sort of opens up to take in all of these other fields and domains. And it works both ways. People trained in crafts move into mural commissions, and people trained as fine artists begin increasingly to turn to textiles, mosaic, and other kinds of surface decoration, other kinds of wall works. Helen Frankenthaler is one of many artists associated with the Coutts stable of artists in the mid-1950s who will end up doing work that again sits at that border between, related to her fine art abstractions, but moving into the realm of decoration, in this case with a Torah arc curtain that she designs for a modernist synagogue in Minnesota. This blending of the fields of muralism and design is especially common when it comes to abstract works, since abstract form and pattern are, after all, very much the language of architecture and of decoration. Huxtable thought that this was where muralism's real publicness lay. Muralism, or large-scale decoration, had a unique ability to make abstraction relevant and meaningful, but precisely by subsuming it under architecture. She wrote in another article, quote, "Whatever criticism may be made of abstract art as an independent expression, it ideally extends contemporary architecture." This was because, she continued, in architecture, abstraction, quote, "makes no extraordinary demands on the viewer. Rather, it calls forth the most direct and primary reactions in the shortest time at the most spontaneous emotional level." Given a home within the spatial play of architecture, abstraction offers a positive and enjoyable experience to many persons who otherwise find it meaningless. And this topic of kind of abstract art has come up in our last discussion of Greta's talk. And Huxtable is claiming here that what might be unintelligible or esoteric in a painting becomes actually much more appealing and much more easily understood when it's incorporated into architecture, which is itself abstract and about the sort of play of shape and form. This is an idea of the mural or of the decorated wall as public in so much as it communicates directly and emotionally at large scale. That is, its publicness has to do with its sensorial and psychological language of forms, one that can reach a modern, mobile public moving through the world where they live and work. And it's very different from other conceptions of the modernist or the abstract mural, where some sense of its boundedness as a work of art persists, along with some sense of its duty to address a collective audience in a more traditional way, even if with an abstract vocabulary. I want to turn now to Susie Frelingheisen, with whose 1941 frescoes I began. Frelingheisen made several frescoes over the course of her career, most of them abstract. The 1941 frescoes for the dining room at her country house in the Berkshires are particularly interesting within her oeuvre because they remain on site at their intended location, and because of the close connection between painting and architecture that underlies them. Frelingheisen and her husband Morris commissioned their Lenox house in 1941, hiring a local architect, John Butler Swan, to build it in a modernist style. And Swan remembers them as very involved in the design process. Swan's house joined Morris's art studio, commissioned about a decade earlier from a Boston architect, George Sanderson, and which you can see in the photograph in the right, sitting above the lower structure. The result was a modernist set of buildings of clean geometric forms, white stucco, and glass block, a vocabulary that earned some faux mockery in the press, given the relatively conservative aesthetic reputation of the Berkshires. And here you're looking at the back of the house from the back garden. In 1941, Frelingheisen and her husband painted several frescoes onto the walls of their new house, including on the ground floor in the stairwell by Morris, in the living room, also by Morris, and in the dining room by Frelingheisen. Frellingheisen's mural career and its subsequent reception is marked by many of the features that I've noted as sort of general components of the mural field. Her interest in architectural scale abstraction developed during the New Deal period, although not, it should be said, as a New Deal sponsored artist, and then continued well into the post-war years. Her dining room frescoes at Lenox also speak to that tension between the mural as a bounded art object and the broader decorative nature of architectural space. So in many ways, the New Deal into post-war career arc, the tension between single artwork and immersive architectural space, and the relative scholarly neglect, Frelingheisen is a very typical case. But she's also not typical, especially in terms of her relatively privileged position compared to many of her artist peers in the 1930s and 40s. Frelingheisen and Morris both came from established families with social connections and enough money to not have to worry about making a living from their art. It was this that earned them the moniker, along with a few other abstract artists, the Park Avenue Cubists. This privileged position is in fact fundamental to one of the most unique aspects of the Lenox frescoes, and that's Frelingeisen's particular authorial role within the house. A lot of the obstacles that murals face over the course of their lifespans, as I've noted, comes from the friction between the many different stakeholders involved: the muralist, the architect, the patron or commissioning body, the users of the space in which the mural is installed. In the case of the Lenox frescoes, Frelingheisen played a central role in all of these domains: mural, architecture, ownership, and use of the house. In this way, her frescoes are an instructive negative example. Their existence and their very ambitious alliance with their architecture owes much to Frelingheisen herself, being artist, patron, and viewer all at once. Frellingheisen's art training was largely informal. Through Maurice's network and art collection, she was introduced to figures such as Juan Gris, Fernand Léger, and Jean Hélion, and her work of the 1930s and early 40s departs from the lessons of French Cubism, and also geometric abstraction. In collages, Frelingheisen uses newsprint, sheet music, corrugated cardboard, and other elements to explore real and fictive textures and depths. Her paintings can be squarely in the Cubist still life tradition, as in the 1938 Partant, or more overtly abstract, playing with overlapping and adjacent geometric forms. Despite her lack of formal training, Frelingheisen quickly established herself within the New York world of abstractionists. By the early 1940s, she was often singled out for mention in reviews of group shows. And she was slated to have a solo exhibition at A.E. Gallatin's Museum of Living Art in 1942, an exhibition that was canceled with the closure of that museum. Frelingheisen was a member of the American Abstract Artists, and like many of her peers in that group, she was both oriented to Europe, and Paris in particular, and committed to an American development of European modernism. Her still life Prétend at far right places herself decisively within this transatlantic juncture, looking to Parisian Cubism, the chair caning motif, the formal influence of Juan Gris, but also to the contemporary US, where Plastique, a trilingual journal founded by her husband Maurice, was featuring her American colleagues, A.E. Gallatin, Charles Shaw, Balcombe Green, alongside European modernists such as Kazimir Malevich, Jean Arp, Sophie Teuber, Hans Richter, and others. Now, one area in which Frelingheisen did receive formal training was muralism, specifically fresco painting. And one of the highlights of this research project has been uncovering that story. Frelingheisen may have first been exposed to fresco technique through her husband, who had studied it in Fontainebleau in 1929. But in 1941, she enrolled in Jean Charlot's mural class at the Art Students League of New York. Charlot had been an instructor on and off at the league since the early 1930s. 1940 to 41 was the final season he taught there. His lost mural, Fresco Class in Action, that I showed earlier, dates from January 1941, and Frelingheisen enrolled about 3 months after that mural was completed in May, spending 2 weeks in the class. Charlot's students were given the league basement as a space to make their frescoes, and there's a remarkable, if partial, record of that work still on the walls. Murals were routinely plastered over for the next set of students, or even cut into to make doors or for other requirements. In essence, the walls were treated as working studio space, not as works of art to be preserved. Nevertheless, a mural very likely by Frelingheisen survives on the south wall of one of the basement rooms. You can see the top of it at the very far left in the photograph. And during recent building works, it was uncovered and photographed. In the mural class with Charlot, Frelingheisen both learned fresco technique and also experimented with translating her abstractions onto the wall. The mural she made there, like her other abstractions of the period, layers a series of trapezoidal and diamond-like forms on top of one another, with occasional curved elements serving as a counterpoint to the predominantly angular geometric vocabulary, and small motifs, like the black dots, acting as focal points within the broader play of forms. In the mural, Frelingheisen has simplified her composition, reducing the number of layered forms and elongating the composition. Unlike many of her abstract easel paintings, which have a real density of forms, the mural at the Art Students League has a lot more openness and clarity. This is a lesson that she'll apply in the murals at Lenox as well, simplifying and spacing out the composition so that they have a static and almost classical quality to them. Frelingheisen painted 4 murals in the dining room at Lenox, likely in the spring or summer of 1941. They ring the north and east walls of the room, a light-filled space just off the entrance foyer, with large glass windows facing out onto the back garden to the south. The forms in the murals come from Frellingheisen's Cubist vocabulary. Tabletop still lifes, musical instruments, and musician or cafe figures abstracted into trapezoids, half circles, elongated cylinders and oblongs, and series of parallel lines. The central mural on the north wall suggests a mask and evokes the mask-like faces of musicians and harlequin figures in French Cubist paintings of the late 19-teens and early 20s. As in her collages, Frelingheisen adds other materials, in this case, corrugated brass, which she uses alongside painted striations to play with illusory and real texture. The sheen of the brass, which varies in alternating stripes. Frelingheisen has painted one edge of each fold. That sheen also connects the murals to the fireplace and andirons below, which offer a vertical counterpoint to the horizontal brass stripes in the murals above. Throughout, there is a blending of the domains of art and design. As the brass in the murals picks up the fireplace and the sheen of ceramic and glassware on the table, and as the painterly ground of the walls, rendered in a feathered textural gray by Frelingheisen, rendered in a sort of textured gray, also connects to the 2 alcoves that she painted on the south wall of the dining room, just opposite the trio of murals. She painted one, there are 2 alcoves, one on either side of that large window that looks out onto the back garden. Again, painted in a textured blue, they pick up the blues of the murals and the texture of the gray wall, and they served as background for a display of decorative objects, plates and small statuettes that Frelingheisen collected. And you can make some of those out in the period photograph in black and white on the left. This integration of art and design was registered by the one period description we have of the dining room, which focuses on the ensemble of colors and materials that Frelingheisen brings together. The journalist, in a profile of the house for Town and Country, writes, let's just go back a slide so we can look at these, quote, "The dining room has gray walls and gray rubber on the floor. The color design in Mrs. Morris's frescoes is blue, black, wine, with copper and brass for reflecting surfaces. The furniture is black lacquer and brass. The side table hooks onto the wall. The room is lighted from cabinets with concealed spotlights," end quote. The integration of art and design is fundamental to the experience of the frescoes, and indeed of the space of the dining room as a whole. Each mural, although relatively static in its composition, seems to float on the textured gray of the painted walls. And Frelingheisen varies the scale and motifs of the overall arrangement to introduce a subtle dynamism so that we alternate as we move around the room between a mural that is larger and then a smaller one, between compositions that are more open and then more bounded, more rectangular, and between pure fresco painting and fresco with brass additions. No architectural elements intrude into the smooth and precise envelope of the dining room. Instead, where architectural modifications are necessary, the room's volume pushes back into the walls, carving out shallow recesses for the fireplace and the 2 small alcoves. The overall experience is one of immersion in a pure, precise geometry, the surface of which has been enlivened or poeticized with textured color, and in the fresco compositions, with a series of further meditations on pure geometric arrangements. And that floating sense, the way in which the murals sit in or even seem to emerge out of the wall, was heightened dramatically at night by the use of the spotlights mentioned in the Town and Country article. Frellingheisen's dining room, like the house as a whole, brings together art, architecture, and design in order to elevate the experience of daily life. It is a space in which aesthetic perceptions are trained and refined through exposure to, through immersion in, a carefully orchestrated modernist space. Frellingheisen's frescoes at Lenox are both exemplary of their time and also highly unique. They reflect the transnational currents of both abstraction and mural painting at mid-century, as it moved between the US, France, and Mexico. They represent a conception of muralism as a holistic ensemble of art with architecture, an idea that has roots in the wall paintings of the 1930s abstractionists, but which will grow in scope in the war and post-war years as muralism increasingly overlaps with design and decoration. Yet they are unique in the synthesis that they accomplish. It is rare for art and architecture to work this seamlessly together, and even rarer for the ensemble to survive this long after its initial production and display. Frellingheisen's Lenox frescoes and their rich worlds of mural pedagogy, modernist architecture, and abstract environment that they illuminate show the rewards of opening up our narratives of modern muralism to include women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was just really, really amazing to learn more about some of the women muralists that have been unfortunately written out of the canon a bit, but to understand some of the challenges they faced. And thank you also for giving us so much insight into the work of Susie Frelingheisen. And I really enjoyed learning a little bit more about these murals for a very different kind of residential space than what I've been studying. So again, at this point, as we did before, I'll moderate some Q&A. We have about 10 minutes. And please, again, use the hand raise function located at the bottom of the screen in the reactions icon if you have a question. I want to actually start off by putting something in the chat that Helen Harrison sent me. She wanted to point out another prominent female muralist, and Emily, you can jump in if you know of this artist. Her name is Hildreth Meyer. Meyer. So I'm going to put this in the chat. There's a link also to her Wikipedia page. And if you wanted to mention.
Yeah, she's another really fascinating muralist, especially because of the way that she kind of spans a generational divide. She's really trained at the kind of end point of the Beaux-Arts mural tradition. And she's part of a group of muralists that are kind of remaking it in a modern, which at that point sort of means a kind of Art Deco mode or style. But her career is long and she's painting well into and through the New Deal period and beyond. She receives extensive commissions. I mean, she does work for churches and permanent murals, but she also receives extensive commissions for the 1939 World's Fair in New York. And I've often thought that it's a really fascinating juxtaposition, the work that she does on mostly on the exterior facades of some of these temporary structures, with some of the more modernist examples that we tend to focus on when we talk about that fair, the work of the American abstract artists, the work of Davis. Interestingly, although she is working in, especially the work for that fair is very much in a kind of, well, it's attempting to sort of update allegory for a modern audience. So it's very much about science and the advancement in communications, et cetera. But it's read as very modern. Lewis Mumford, I think it's Lewis Mumford, singles her out in one of his reviews of the art at the fairgrounds, and he calls it, meaning this as a great compliment, a kind of billboard art. He says it's a kind of art that actually reads from afar with the kind of direct impact that a poster has or that a billboard has, and that's really what we want to see from our muralism going forward. We don't want to see this sort of stale academicism that is what we used to think of as muralism. Thank you, Helen Harrison, for that question. That's a great figure to sort of add into the conversation.
Great. I'm going to call on Greta next, who has her hand up, and then after that, we have a question from Wanda Korn. So we'll start with Greta. You can unmute now.
Are these murals actually shaped canvases?
These the ones by Frelingheisen?
Yes.
No, they're not. They're actually painted onto the walls. She did a lot of the other frescoes that she did were sort of portable frescoes. This goes back to a question asked in the introduction, the difference between a painting and a mural. For me, the kind of signature difference is that a mural is designed for a specific architectural space. So both Frellingheisen's portable murals and these, I think, are murals, but these are actually fresco. They're actually in and on the walls.
It's so interesting because from here, they look like they're shaped canvases or sort of assemblage that are put onto the wall because they pop out so much.
They do. They pop out so much. They have that kind of very sharp contour. It's interesting that in some places in the frescoes, especially in that central one over the fireplace, that she adds in a little bit of almost modeling and shading within the forms, but not at all around the edges. They do have that kind of very sharp defining edge between them and then the rest of the wall.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say one thing about Art Deco because I didn't mention it before. There were a lot of murals that were done in kind of an Art Deco form, especially some at Bellevue Hospital by Luis Arenal and some others. So that's another form when we talk about modernism. There are so many permutations and ways that it can be done. Thank you.
Greta. So I'm going to call on Wanda next. I'm asking you to unmute, Wanda.
Great. Hi, everyone. That was terrific, Emily, and I'm so excited to sort of see the study of murals by women moving into the middle of the 20th century. And I'm not sure whether you mentioned this or not, but one of the hats I wear is to be an advocate for visiting. Particularly, I like to push art historians into thinking more about using artists' homes and studios as primary evidence, sort of the material culture that you find in them. And you've just done an exquisite job. Of course, you also have an exquisite set of preserved murals, which is terrific. And I'm so glad to see you give some attention to these murals because I don't know of much attention to them at all. But did you mention that the house is open to the public?
I didn't, and I absolutely should have. That is an excellent point. I wonder if Marluz could even put that, or Jenny or Marluz could put a link to the house in the chat. It is open to the public. The Frelingheisen Morrishausen studio. It's run by Kenny Frelingheisen, Susie's nephew. And they're open sort of through a spring into early fall calendar, but they're a really fascinating place to visit, not far from the Norman Rockwell Museum, a lot of things to see. And they have, in addition to the murals that I'm showing you, a fantastic art collection.
Yes.
Morris was just an incredible, I mean, he was in these studios in Paris. He knew these artists personally, and they have a wonderful collection, including works by Gris and Picasso, as well as some of the American abstractionists that they worked alongside. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, and we could mention Chesterwood, Daniel Chester French
absolutely.
is also
Yes.
just around the corner. So you can do a threesome if you're just into the artist homes and studios.
That's right.
And they all belong to the historic artist homes and studios. And I just wanted to say that Kenny, the man who is in charge of preserving this wonderful house, was one of the founding members of Historic Artist Homes and Studios. So I believe, which just had its 20th birthday, I believe this was one of our first, he was part of the first 20 homes and studios that were recognized and brought into membership. And if I can just also put in a personal plug in a way, but one of the things that I so enjoyed about your talk was the way it continues the story and starts to do some of the hard work about your opening questions. Why have women muralists been sort of disregarded, and what are some of the reasons for that? And the unabashed publicity here is that I wanted to put a plug in for my book on public murals by women at the women's building of 1893, where you have the entire decorative scheme was by women who never did any more murals other than what they did there, and they've all been lost. So all we have are photographic representation. No, I think there's one actually or two that we've got fragments of and so on. and then also I would say that the story of George O'Keeffe, who wanted to do a mural very, very badly, never had a chance to do it, or when she had it, it went badly. So it's a story well known. But anyway, thanks for moving this story along. And I do think it sort of starts in the late 19th century and then moves as you have.
Thank you so much. And I quoted that line about Violet Oakley. I could have just as well quoted some of the coverage from exactly as you're saying, some of the coverage that you even talk about in your book about the women's building and the sort of responses to women making, large scale murals for a civic structure. Absolutely.
Anyway, terrific talk. Thank you.
Thank you. And Marluz did put the link to the Frelingheisen house and studio in the chat. So thank you for doing that. Let's take, it's 12:30, so let's take one more question from Barbara Lyons, and then we'll take a break, and there'll be more opportunity to ask questions later on in the day.
I just want to say, in response to aspects of what Wanda said, that O'Keeffe did a mural at the H&M Ranch in Alcalde that was covered up. And I've always wanted to get to Alcalde. I've been there many times, but I've always wanted to approach the issue of seeing if the mural's still there, because it's been painted over. So Wanda, you and I have to join hands on that and see if we can't get that, actualized, because it would be really interesting to discover that. She, of course, wanted to paint a mural at the Fine Arts Museum in Santa Fe, and they could not allow a single artist to do that at the time. But anyway, if we could get that mural uncovered, it'd be terrific. Thank you.
Agreed. Thank you so much. So thank you again to Emily. This is really a stimulating talk. I really appreciate your contribution to this symposium. After lunch, we'll reconvene at 1:30, and we'll turn our attention back a little bit more directly to swing landscape at that time with our next two talks. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and we'll take a break for an hour.